Good morning, everybody. My name is Maputi Mabuja. I'm a master's student at Wits University, and I'm the chair for the first two presentations. Our first presentation is by Londiwe Mtshali, and our second presentation is by Marang Motswai. So our first presentation, Ms. Londiwe Mtshali, she is the founder of the Secret Society of Publishers, and she's a phenomenal artist, and she'll be talking about rethinking her. Take it. Hi, everyone. Hi. Oh, how are you feeling today? Good. Okay. So, for my presentation, I wanted to do something a bit experimental. So just like everybody, if you could please participate, please use your pencils and paper, and let's think about the next couple of things that I'm going to ask you. Okay. So firstly, what is your favorite color? You can write it, you can doodle, you can do anything on the paper. Any color, any amount, any amount. Any color at all, just whatever your favorite color is. So next, I want you all to think about, what do you think that color tastes like? What do you think the color tastes like? It could be any taste at all. What the color tastes like? What do you think it tastes like? Next, I want to ask you to think about, what do you think the color smells like? What your favorite color smells like? What it smells like. Okay, moving slightly away from color, I want you to think about, what do you think a home is? What do you think a home is? It can be anything that comes to mind, just what you think a home is. Next question is, what does home feel like to you? What does your home feel like?
What does home feel like to you? Next question is, what does it smell like? What does your home smell like? Next question, what does it taste like? What does it sound like? And finally, what colors remind you of home? What colors remind you of home? Thank you all for participating. Thank you so much. So, my name is Londiwe Mtshali, and in my master's research, I have given myself the task of thinking about home and thinking about particularly the ways in which women and people that are oppressed or previously were oppressed come up with ways of making themselves homes or building homes, especially in places where they should not exist. Finding a way to cultivate home spaces and homescapes where they shouldn't exist. Primarily in my research, I've been thinking about an area called Motswai, a space where you can track most of my lineage. It's a space where my great-grandmother, my grandmother, my mother, and soon my sister will be building a home. A space where they should not be building because in most rural areas, women are not allowed to own homes. But yet, their homes exist. So I wanted to ask myself and to ask everybody here if you could define what a home was. And so hopefully, by the end of this, we could all rethink what a home is. A home is not necessarily a space that has a couple of walls and a roof. A home is a feeling. A home is a smell. A home can be a sound, a taste, or even a look. As I returned here to Joburg for this conference, I had this overwhelming feeling of home. Maybe it's because I've been here before, but there's something heartwarming about how everybody looked at me with the biggest smiles on their faces and hugged me, even if we'd only shared a few conversations. So I asked myself this question: what does it feel like to be home? I asked you all this question: what does it feel like to be home? And I had to, on the phone with my mom, ask her what she felt like to be home. She said, feeling like you're at home can be the smell of a makui. It can be the smell of incredibly good food, or even food that you've left over on the pot and it started to burn. Feeling like you're at home is an overwhelming feeling of belonging, even if sometimes you may not all get along. I asked her, what does it smell like when you're at home? And she said, it's the smell of crisp grass, the smell of sand that had just been rained on, and the smell of chickens running around in a coop. That's the smell of home. But for me, as I returned here, it is the smell of concrete. Sometimes it's the faint smell of pee on the streets. Just faint. It's the smell of books when I walked into the library, and it's the smell of slightly faint perfumes that may irritate my sinuses, but are still amazing to smell. My goodness, it's good to be home. What is the taste of home? For me, it's a couple of cappuccinos that were a bit cold that I was served at the banister, but it's alright, it's good vibes. It's coming here and talking to Lydia and sharing sweets that were brought from Pick and Pay. The taste of home is a slightly weird, almost papery taste of an edible flower. It's the taste of the color green. Strangely, I remarked to KG as we were having a conversation after sharing food during the lunch break. It's this weird taste that you can't really explain, but it stays on the tip of your tongue, and that is home. What does it sound like? Well, yesterday it sounded like a weird ribbing competition outside as I tried to listen to a presentation. But anyway, it's vibes. And I listened to Mom from my room at the banister. It's okay. It's good to be home. What does the color of home look like? Maybe it's a sea of blue seats. Maybe it is. Maybe it's Camilla's always coordinated brown outfits that I love so much. Maybe it's the mixture of red, yellow, and white from my installation style. I don't really know what the answers are, but strangely in my mind, looking at a black background, thinking about what it feels like, what it smells like, what it tastes like, and what it sounds like, and what colors are associated with home, your mind is forced to just think. What started off as a strange exercise that I did with my English students when I was teaching English as a second language has taught me that when you are rethinking home, you have to turn off your mind and float downstream. Thank you.
Thank you, Londi. That was a really, really great presentation. Londiwe's presentation unpacks the poetics of what home is, and she kind of like allows you to tap into the somatic feelings of what home is by assigning color, taste, you know. Thank you, Londi. Our next presenter is Marang Motswai. and he will be talking about the exhibition at the Novel Foundation called When Rain Clouds Gather, which is curated by Posha Malachi and Nontobeko Mtombela. Take it away, Marang.
Oops. Yeah. Yeah? Like that? I think I'm finding it.
Yeah.
Should I do the slideshow from here or download it?
I think it's already downloaded. But if you can try from doing it from the next one also. Are you comfortable with that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
What?
Oh, is that good? Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Marang, and I wanted to talk about an exhibition held in Cape Town and how I feel like it brings forward new approaches to decolonial curatorial practices. And I have like 3 examples I kind of want to talk about. But first, I kind of want to talk about what I mean by decolonial approaches. And I'm specifically talking about like Walter Magnolo's idea of epistemic disobedience, kind of trying to challenge these notions of knowledge being produced in certain places and that having priority. So that idea of Africans only being able to talk about African work, whereas people from Western countries can kind of talk about everything with a bit of authority. And I like how this exhibition kind of disrupts those geopolitics of knowing. So there's a bunch of, so I just want to first explain what the exhibition was actually about. Sorry, I'm not much of a presenter, but this will get through. So it was an exhibition held in Cape Town from February this year till January next year, with a specific focus on women artists of the 20th century, because they're usually overlooked in art history, especially black artists. And the co-curators, Posha Malaki and Nontobeko Ntomela, wanted to kind of put a feminist lens on the history of the 20th century of South African art. So they had like a huge roster of artists. And what I also love about that is there's a lot of very familiar names like Helen Swede or your Bongi Wedwamo. But then there's also a bunch of names that I don't think people really are familiar with. And I love this kind of mixing those two, because in this kind of catalog, you don't want to kind of just force the idea of being a black South African woman onto only popular ones, because that isn't the reality. I just wanted to show a video that isn't going to show. But it was just about just showing the different works on display. They had these different rooms where in each room they would kind of try to tackle a different concept. There were concepts from the political to love and pleasure and intimacy to land, spirituality, and these were all separated and connected through the space dedicated towards land, which was also just an interesting idea as to how all of these things are connected to the idea of land and finding your place. But also there was this challenge to the idea of modern art, where they would put things like craft and tapestry in with the likes of like Valerie Desmore, who's a very famous South African modern artist. And what's interesting about that is that craft is usually relegated and seen as like a lesser form of art compared to modern art, and by putting this, it kind of disrupts that notion, which is super important in my idea. But what I really was interested about was their use of archiving and how they kind of disrupted again the ways people usually archive to allow for more flexibility and more inclusion, which is super important in decolonial practice. I want to talk about the idea of archive fever, which is taking this idea of disobedience and epistemic skepticism and moving it onto the idea of archives and thinking of different ways in which we can conceptualize what an archive is, what it's supposed to give us. And one of my favorite ideas of what an archive is that it's not just a place we put knowledge, but it's also a place where we can mine and extract knowledge, we can learn about things. It isn't necessarily a thing that says, this is how things are, but more, this is how things were done, which is a very interesting way of looking at it. It's a less concrete way and a less, I don't like ideas where things seem like this is the only way of thinking about a thing, so it's nice to kind of challenge those notions. In this exhibit, there was a few different praxis involved in making it kind of a decolonial approach. One was a ever-expanding chronology at the beginning of the exhibition where all the material used in the making of the exhibition was archived, and over time it was added to and removed if necessary to kind of show that this process of understanding these things isn't like a straightforward process. It takes research, going back, reevaluating things, and which isn't something most exhibitions are able to kind of show, which gives this presentation of like things are done this way and then they're done and then we move on and that's just how they are. And then the inclusion of different types of art, like I was saying with craft and stuff like that. And then also an appreciation for an artist's agency, which can be overlooked sometimes. There's this specific artwork by Bongi Hlomo, which is called Artist Unknown at the End of the Day. What she kind of wanted to do was have a series dedicated to the idea of these unsung artists in society that never really get their credit. But people didn't really get that she wanted it to be credited to an unknown artist. So the name became Artist Unknown at the End of the Day rather than At the End of the Day by an Artist Unknown. And that's how it's kind of been recorded in history from its conception. But this exhibition is careful to try show that story that Bongi wanted to like put forward, which is super important because without doing that, you do change the meaning of the work and you do diminish the artist's agency a little bit. And then there's also this idea of like the porous archive, which I was talking about, where they would allow works to be taken out or put in if they learned new information rather than at the start of the exhibition being like, this is what's in it, this isn't what's in it. This kind of, it allows for more democracy and more stories to be told, more narratives to be included. The inclusion of different arts like craft and into a modern art space is just another form of epistemic disobedience, breaking away from traditional ideas of knowledge and what is and isn't, and trying to reshape them in ways that allow more comfort for indigenous populations of like more colonized lands. And what I love about this is it kind of brings a new way of thinking about chronology. Instead of thinking of things as like a linear kind of structure, if one thing happens in another, you can kind of start to see that it's more of a web-like structure with different nodes of inspiration in different places and different hotspots of inspiration as well, instead of like just one thing in a sequential pattern. But what I really liked about the exhibition was that it shows that even like in a medium that seems ephemeral, like staging an exhibition, something that's here today and then can be finished, and then there isn't that exhibition physically anymore. It shows how these things still have a lasting impact after their conclusion. Like in art history, in South African art history, these things can always be re-brought up and can kind of create precedents. And I like that the curators, the co-curators, really did try to push the boundaries while trying to respect why there are those boundaries. Because I think it can be a very daunting prospect thinking about trying to challenge ideas, especially in places where there's been previous harm, because you don't want to further that harm, but it doesn't mean that you can't kind of try address things. You can try to like fail better than people before you almost. But yeah, I just really was really inspired by what they did and how they kind of brought these new approaches to archiving that are very decolonial in nature, and I think very important in like the art historical canon of South Africa, if you will. But yeah, thank you guys for your time.
Okay. Thank you, Marang. That was a very interesting presentation as well, because he tackles decolonial approaches to curatorial practices. He also talks about how the archive and the canon, and about hypervisibility and like invisibility at times, and also about placing women of color, artists of color, in South African art history. And also in his presentation, there are a lot of tones of community in also the work of the curators, and handling with care all these artworks and placing them in certain ways, and challenging the ideas of chronology, and also that too speaks to mapping as well. So we're going to do a Q&A session with Londi and Marang. Do you guys have any questions? I'll pick you out and you can just, okay, Shireen.
Thank you very much for both of your presentations. Londi, it's really nice to see how this experimental work has sort of developed in the kind of experiments you've been doing around both specific spaces that are matriarchally owned, but also that where the boundaries are porous. So home becomes this movable entity. Doing your exercise, I had all this, I did learn all of these things, and then halfway through it, thinking, and I'm writing about home, and I realized that I'm not writing about the home I live in right now, but I'm writing about my parents' home, which no longer exists. And I wanted to cry, because I think, you know, selling the house was quite a huge thing, but not having that place to go home to. But the fact that when you did this prompt and I was writing automatically, that was the home I thought of. And it was, you know, it was filled with a lot of violence, but also a lot of love. And so my home is very different from that, because it doesn't have that violence in it, except the ones I drink. But, so, you know, to graft your own house is very different from what you think you don't want. But then when you say home, and I'm writing about that space, and that, so it was, yeah, I just at a certain point felt like crying with the exercise, which testifies to the power of the exercise. Marang, thank you so much for giving attention to this. I think what is like one of the, you know, 4 major exhibitions that happened since 1994. So I think, you know, scholars like yourself giving attention, speaking about the various features of it, helps the afterlife of exhibitions. The one thing I will challenge you is to, as you're moving forward with your decolonial methodology, is to reconsider some of the terms you're using. So things like craft, what was the other term that you used as well? There was one other term. It will come back to me, so we can have a conversation later. But, you know, though that sort of sets up the same colonial enterprises by using the terminology and especially if you're referring to sort of Walter Mignolo and decolonialist thesis, there's a fundamental questioning around the terminologies that came into being in the 1700s and colonial encounters. So to rethink how you sort of write that, and also just how, it would be interesting to hear more about how you're thinking about a decolonial archive that is, in this case, very feminist. And so what is the kind of languaging as well that you find appropriate to the ways in which women work and voice themselves?
That's very fair.
Can I respond? Oh, okay. Sorry. If I could just respond to you, Charlene. Something that I did, I don't know if I need to get closer to the mic, sorry, if you can hear me. Something that I noticed when I did the exercise before is that there is this kind of interplay, especially in the Zulu language, and I think in other African languages as well, where there is this idea of placing the word home in different ways. So in Zulu we have kwako and ngini. So kwako is your space. It legitimately means your place, and that's the kind of home that you set up for yourself. And then ngini is what most people refer to as home in English. And so doing this exercise, I've been seeing a lot of times where people start off thinking about your place or kwako, and then somehow it just translates to gini, to your familial home or where you grew up. So I'm really, really interested, and I guess your response just goes to prove exactly what we've been doing this whole time with this experiment, and thank you.
On those points you raised, they're so poignant because I think I always have this thing of wanting to really challenge myself, and then I end up in a field that has so many almost neglected considerations that I fall into those traps, but I'm always trying to see them. So it's really helpful hearing where I might be kind of overlooking something. I'd never really thought about recontextualizing how I speak about craft and thinking of other ways to use it, because it is such a loaded term. Even though I disagree with the way it's been loaded, it has been loaded. And then also the idea of speaking on a show with such a feminist lens, it is so important to get feedback on those things, because there are just shortfalls that I don't see until they're brought up. But it's such a interesting topic that I keep getting gravitated back to it, and I think it would be an injustice to myself if I kind of was like, oh no, I don't get this, let me run away. But I know that's not what you're saying, I'm just expressing. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, and really I'd be interested in because I think there's a lot of people who works on archiving and decolonizing archiving, but then move to recognizing what an archive is in the global South context, is a step away even from decolonization, right? It is defining it according to our parameters. So, and there's already things about, theorizing around malleability process that's really outstanding about the way that you're starting to think about this. So I'm very keen about those aspects.
Any more questions? Yes, people?
I do have a, just really kind of building on from Charlene's point and Charlene's many points, particularly really especially thinking about a kind of decolonial archive, right? And my kind of, the kind of relations of how to kind of visualize or kind of allow a more expanded kind of working or thinking around the decolonial archive. So in the presentation, what kept on popping up for me is that if we are to think about actual physical archives, right, exist in the metric of either a very alphabetical A to Z per parameter, or like 0 to 10 or like 0 to 9 per parameters. And in thinking about like this in relation to a chronology, and then in contrast to in contrast to thinking about like what you said about like a web of references, particularly like that kind of relationship for me, I think that there's a really kind of potent tension that I'm curious to speaking to you afterwards about, actually, because it's the same kind of tenuous like traps and gaps that like one can't see particularly.
No, I do hear you. I guess what I was more intrigued by it was the representation of a new format, rather than like, it isn't a solve all, right? Like it isn't gonna kind of be this perfect outlook, but I'd been so trapped in seeing the traditional chronology that it was refreshing to see people notice that that's not necessarily always correct and try to do something to address that. It can still be a very dangerous thing, but also that's why I was talking about this idea of failing better than previous people, because I think otherwise we just repeat the things that have already, like it ends up being the devil you know, rather than trying to push things, you know. I'm not sure if I addressed your question. No problem.
Any more questions? Yes.
Yeah, my response is sort of interlaced between both presentations. So your idea of failing better than the previous generation, and Londi's idea of her grandmother, great-grandmother, sister, sort of building home in a place where they're not supposed to build home. Mm-hmm. So with that, it kind of gave me this thought of archiving being a home for art, in a way, and that home being revisited and visited again to look at what was there and what is being added on. Mm-hmm. Sort of similarly with a home, like a parent is gonna build somewhere, and then a child, as they work, they're gonna extend, they're gonna add a couch nyana, they're gonna add something to make it more home. Mm-hmm. So similarly with the archive, because it's the home for art. So you keep adjusting and readjusting to make it, to give it that certain image for the art that you're archiving, to make it that sort of whole, so that whenever something similar to that, to that which is in the archive, can fit in a certain type of way. So this idea of failing better than the previous generation, of just trying to adjust every now and again, adding something, taking something away, to me, that sort of also speaks to this notion of whole and creating this whole.
I see that 100%. That's interesting.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Londiwe and Marang. Thank you both for the lovely presentation. Londiwe, I thought your presentation was quite sweet in terms of you got us thinking about our homes, what it means to be home, and you also got me thinking about my grandmother's home as well, which is something quite interesting, because sometimes, especially what Charlene said, where she says both her parents and her home is gone, it's kind of like you recollect your definition of being home. It's just a comment anyway. So it was something quite interesting regarding that. And then Marang, I'm not sure if it's going to be a comment or it's going to be a question. So I'll just, I found your presentation quite fascinating in terms of, previously we had the Black aesthetic at the Standard Bank, and then there's a show that opened at the Javits a couple of months ago, where they're dealing with the excluded blacks within the spaces, the museums and the galleries, and it was curated, or it was collected by, the works were collected by Ubongi Hlomo, which is quite fascinating that you mentioned her name, which as well I felt there was more to her name. Because when you're dealing with the history of Rocksdrift, there was another conference at the Bed Factory a couple of years ago where Bongi Hlomo was not invited. And being a black female figure in a masculine environment, which is also quite fascinating that she also led this Javed collection. But another thing that came up, which I also find that there's a lot of females missing in history in terms of the arts, which is something that I'm glad that Unondo and Oposha, they're addressing it. But there's still a lot of other gaps, because you get these females who practice art, but they vanish somehow within the marriage system, or they don't get recognized because we live in a very male patriarchal system as well. So, and another thing as well, which was also fascinating about this show, the female voice in a public space is still missing, because the articles that are written about this show, it's coming from a male point of view. We're still missing a voice of how women are seeing this exhibition and coming up. In the entire Black aesthetic shows, there were 2 female in that exhibition. That was done by Standard Bank, curated by Dr. Sani. 2. I don't know what I was trying to say. There was somewhere I was going with this. But again, it's a beautiful show that we are addressing. But I would also like to see, from your point of view, how do you bring in the female voice in this? Because we can say it's a beautiful show, you liked it. So what? Mm-hmm. So how do we take it further to say, these women are here, they were present, within history. Mm-hmm. But why did they disappear within this history? What is their voice at the current, present moment? Yes, we are dealing with the archives, but the archives, they don't work in isolation from the present moment. I don't know if you get where I'm going with this. Yeah, so it will be nice just to bring in, the excluded voices within. Because even having them on the walls, on the 4 walls of the gallery, does not mean they're present. I don't know if you understand where I'm going with this. No. Yeah, so it will be nice to see their presence in terms of their voices. I don't know.
I do agree with what you're both saying, because it is a big issue. Like, I also tried to research some of the artists in the show, and if you don't see something about them, then you'll see something about like the male curator they were working with, so it is a big issue. Yeah, I do agree with you both.
I just wanted to say as well, like, I know we're talking now in terms of like a singular archive, like there is like a singular archive, but it's actually like multiple, because I've had to do like some really like deep dive research into like these, I guess, forgotten female artists. And the problem is that, it's not like, if you do find like a resource that would be like really good, like, the artist's journal or something like that, it's locked in an archive somewhere where it's no longer accessible. So this idea of like access, or like getting access to these resources, I don't know, like I get it, it's a precious resource, but there is something in like actual like dissemination, or actually getting this information out here. Like, we give like pop culture and like social media like a really bad rep, but like, I mean, that's how like things get like heard. Like, this is how these stories like, get heard more. Those are also like archives, and yes, they're not as like, reputable as like, for instance, like the formal structures, like those books that we got in school that, like you said, don't even have half the information, but there's definitely a point to that. Yeah.
But this is another thing. Growing up in a township, you walk into people's houses, you find paintings on the walls, not the the female with the child holding or the child crying, but there will be artworks or a sculpture. And then maybe because I've always wondered who did that sculpture. In almost each and every house in the township, in the rural areas. But again, we're look at it, oh, nice artwork, and then we just let it go. And now, because we are in an academic space, you kind of like think back and say, why don't we do that artwork? Because now you're starting to think, in a different way. So I think that's just it.
I think also this notion of knowledge creation and sharing, these figures that are held at a high position, when speaking about this knowledge that is created and shared, these figures also sort of in a way gatekeep this information. So sometimes, as you were saying, some resources aren't really accessible, but sometimes some resources are just not found anyway because they were not accepted as a reliable source or something, like social media. Social media is really frowned upon and stuff like that, but then a lot of things are held there. A lot of people that I grew up with would probably say that a lot of their memories and whatever are somewhere in a folder in Facebook, somewhere, because they know that's where they can be trapped in a way. If someone was interested in finding out about them in their teenagers or something, they're gonna go to their Facebook profile and find them and see what sort of life they were leading at the time. And sort of small things like that hint at this notion that sources are in all shapes, forms, and sizes, because for a certain piece of research that someone is doing, maybe a video on TikTok could give some insight on something that they weren't even aware of because they were looking at it from a standpoint of a super academic research or something, but then that slight shift of focus or looking at it from a different lens sort of gives a new pathway to lead the research in a way, and then that will then create this this other form of knowledge building, where knowledge isn't only this linear thing where you have to look at who made it, who collected the thing that was made, and that type of vibe. But yeah, knowledge creation is it's a very interesting.
Can I just hand it over to this lady and then I'll give it to people?
Thank you so much. I just wanted to first commend the organizers of this event for opening it to the general public because I don't think it assists you as art practitioners to talk amongst yourselves. So I've learned something today about art, and it's really piqued my interest. And I'll look at art very differently as of today. So thank you for that. And then to the presenters, Londiwe, I think your name is Charlene. Like Charlene, the questions you are asking kind of evoked a very sentimental, emotional feeling within me. Unlike most of you, I didn't have the pleasure of experiencing my grandparents' home, and apartheid had a lot to do with that. But my kids have had that pleasure. And I watch them and I'm filled with such a sense of joy that they're experiencing what I experienced when I was growing up in my home. So when you were explaining the concept of kwakho and kokwenu, I could relate because that's exactly how I describe home. For me is my parents' home, and then my house is their home. So that's the distinction we make. And so, like she said earlier on, that was a very sweet presentation, but also very impactful, And then Marang, you were talking about inclusion, but you are looking at inclusion from the perspective of the artist and the art practitioner, but there's a consumer out there, and a neglected potential consumer of art. And that would be a person like myself and many other Black South Africans who've never been a part of this, who've never been in the space before. They don't understand it, they don't relate to it. We buy pieces of art, we don't know the meaning behind them. I don't understand why a certain piece of artwork has to be this, priced in this way and another one in a different way. The distinction, for instance, between craft and art, why? So today, when you were doing the presentation, I got to understand somewhat that distinction and why it's important for us not to make that distinction in the way that it has been made, previously. But for me, the aspect that I think you should be thinking about, going further with, developing this concept is the inclusion of the consumer, the neglected consumer, because they are there. And I think we need to bring people along with us as we, get into these spaces and we get to understand them.
It is also like a very loaded question, actually, that how do you make it more accessible to like just the general public and keep it out of these very inaccessible places like the Norval Foundation. When I was speaking to the curators about it, they were actually talking about how conflicted they were about where they put it, but they chose to put it there because they didn't want, there's like this image of where art should be if it's good art, right? And they didn't want to like forfeit the idea of all the works there being good art and then put it somewhere where they can be damaged or people won't trust them having the works and stuff like that, so they can't put everything. But then they end up in a very very exclusive space that's only really accessible to people with capital and time and stuff like that. And it doesn't really hit the intended audience at the end of the day, which is firstly Black South Africans and Black women South Africans as well. And I think that also goes back to the talk about social media and how those spaces could be kind of maybe used to give a greater exposure, because the broader society is on those spaces. You don't have to go find a new place to find them. But I think there is also a difference about being there in person and seeing the work. So yeah, work does need to be done in making things accessible. It's very important.
Okay, Tebo?
I'm just really kind of thinking, like, back to your question, G, even with things so for example, like I'm just thinking perhaps like as a potential kind of opening up, like what if like the TikTok video, right, that was made in like, I don't know, 1967 for example, right? Like what was happening in a different place at that specific time in 1967 in Uganda, for example, right? And I feel like, and like things like that, and like I'm kind of thinking about like musically, like the idea of a compilation, of bringing things together, of a gathering of material from like newspaper articles to police reports to poets that were writing at the time, because like poets are like, they theorize linguistically, artists theorize visually, like visual artists, that is, right? So like there's like a kind of like sonic thing, there's a poetic thing, newspaper journals, and like that is able to kind of like compile a time and a place for those artworks to exist in. Like perhaps maybe like that's a way to do it, as opposed to like one thing, one work, one idea, one thing, right? Because like SABC1 did it with like the Yamabela thing, like it was like SABC1 in TV plus YFM on the radio, that related to like other parties that were happening in like Soshanguve or like Kosprit, you know, and then there were like posters in there. So like when you start to do that, then like you're able to build like a school of thought. Like perhaps maybe like those are ways to, like maybe that's like a different way to think about that as a curatorial practice beyond the physical museum.
That is interesting.
We're really short on time, but this conversation has been really, really great. But however, I just would like to get just quick comments or questions, just really quick ones from you next, and then lady at the back behind table, if you don't mind, just making it really quick, concise, so we can close it in just like under 6 minutes.
I just wanted to tie in with, sorry, I don't know your name, but what you were saying about the targeted audience. So from my understanding, this entire art world operates in a particular system, right? It starts with the artist and the artist, not the institution that trains the artist, then it's the artist, and the artist goes on to find a curator then goes on to find a gallery then goes on to find a museum if possible, and then a buyer thereafter. But somewhere down the line, there's always like main institutions that are leading the forefront for the artist's work or for the curator's name, and I mean they need to get paid as well, right? But from my understanding is that it's not just the work itself that needs to be questioned, it's the institutions that cover those works, it's the audience that's being gatekept from it, because you must remember that these institutions have a wide variety of network in order to reach out to public media to say, hey, come through, this is happening, and why not reach out to the broader audience at the same time? How is that benefiting the next generation to come if we're always going to be worrying about how to fix now, how to fix what happened yesterday? We've got to try and be more progressive and faster. So yeah, just something in terms of gatekeeping and the information that's being shared out there. So it's not just the artists themselves, it's how it's then operates within the entire overall system in art and general.
Next.
Thank you. I'm going to try to be as quick as I can. But firstly, thank you to both of you. It was loading. I was so emotional when we were doing the exercise of writing about home, especially because of the kind of like dislocation that like moving from Eastern Cape does to the city. Like moving from Eastern Cape to the city, even though you're moving with your family. For me, as I was writing, I realized that maybe similarly to you, home is not necessarily like a kai makai. Even though there's that sense of, yes, you do feel like, hey, sometimes like, if I can go home. But I realized that home for me is more like the space or the intimacies and moments that I share even with my parents and my immediate family and people around me. And it was quite funny. I just wanted to also make a comment about the kind of ways in which women can have spaces to call their own, like kwako at home. And maybe it's a bit different for us at Eastern Cape, but actually there is provision for women in some villages, because like if I'm from Eastern Cape, if I'm from any village where there's a king, the king is obliged to give me a piece of land, even if I'm not married or whatever. If I just belong to the land, to that place, I can go and request for space, and they have the responsibility to allow me to inhabit a space. So it's quite interesting to see that there are places where that's not a thing. And maybe you can look into that, like how different spaces in Africa, in South Africa, maybe particularly in rural areas, what kind of agency do women have in having their own place to build and create their own homes? Because my grandmother had her own house, because she literally raised her children without her husband because her husband died. And so she had that land, it was hers, it was her house, nobody came at her about it. Maybe she was just lucky, I don't know. But yeah, it was very interesting to kind of experience, like you start to think about the politics of what home is, and especially as a black person, especially one with kind of a rural history. And then I wanted to also comment on Marang's presentation. Thank you so much. But like I don't know, maybe it's like an unpopular opinion that I might have. But I felt as though I agree with you to an extent in terms about African women representation in the archive and their work being recorded and kept, and then also being given an opportunity for us to extract that kind of knowledge from their stuff. But I kind of wanted to say that I think the responsibility is on both the creator or the artist and also the people who are creating that archive in how their work is maintained in history and kept alive for future people to access that work. And I don't know how I felt, for me personally, about the issue of like a person got married and then they disappeared from the archive, because I feel like that's the person's personal choice to get married, and I don't think we should demonize their choice. But I think there should be better ways, better ways for both the artists and the people who are recording their work to still keep their work alive regardless of what last name they carry. I think that we should allow women to still be what they want to be, whether they want to carry a nigga's surname or not. I think we should still have the responsibility to keep their work alive regardless of whose name they carry. I don't think that we should demonize their personal choices. Yeah, I think that's what I want to say.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we can't take everybody's comments, but after this, I guess you can talk to the presenters personally and interact with them. Thank you to the presenters.
Thank you.
That was excellent. Thank you guys for the conversation.